Hey guys, tonight, we're going somewhere a little darker than usual, but don't worry, it's the calm kind of dark. The quiet kind. The kind where nothing really happens, and that's sort of the point. So maybe dim your lights a little, get comfortable, lie back, and let your mind slowly drift, because tonight, we're stepping into the slow, uneventful, and strangely repetitive world of a medieval dungeon prisoner. Not the dramatic movie version, no loud screams, no sudden escapes, no heroic rescues. Just, long days that all feel exactly the same. So, let's begin. Imagine waking up, except, not really waking up, because sleep and waking don't feel very different here. There's no sunlight to guide you, no morning birds, no gentle shift from night to day. Just darkness. Thick, unmoving darkness that sits quietly around you, like it has nowhere else to be. A prisoner in a medieval dungeon didn't wake up to an alarm clock, or even to a rooster. If anything woke them, it was discomfort. Maybe the stiffness in their back from sleeping on cold stone. Maybe the slow ache in their joints. Or maybe, just the realization that they hadn't really slept at all. Because sleeping in a dungeon wasn't exactly restful. There were no beds, of course. That would be far too generous. At best, there might be a bit of damp straw, and even that was probably not fresh. More like, reused. Very reused. And slightly alive with things you'd rather not think about right now. So the prisoner would shift slightly, chains lightly scraping against stone, a quiet, metallic sound that becomes oddly familiar over time. Not loud, not dramatic, just constant. Like background noise in a life that has very little else going on. And yes, chains. Not always, but often enough. Around the ankles, sometimes the wrists. Not tight enough to cause immediate pain, just enough to remind you that movement is limited. That your world is small. Very small. Stretching, if it could even be called that, was minimal. Maybe a slight adjustment. Maybe sitting up, if there was space. Some dungeon cells were barely large enough to lie down in fully. Others allowed a bit more movement, but not much. Comfort was not part of the design. Now, normally, this would be the part of the day where someone might go about their routine. Brush their teeth, have breakfast, check their phone, normal things. But here, routine is something much simpler. You wait. That's it. You just, wait. Time doesn't pass in hours or minutes. It sort of, melts. Without light, without any clear markers, a prisoner's sense of time would slowly fade. Days blend together. Nights don't feel different. Everything becomes one long, stretched-out moment. And somewhere in that slow stretch of nothingness, eventually, food might arrive. Not always at the same time. Not always consistently. But at some point, you might hear it. Footsteps. Faint at first, echoing slightly through stone corridors. A distant sound that gradually becomes clearer. And for a brief moment, something changes. Not excitement exactly, but awareness. Because footsteps mean, something is happening. A guard approaches. Maybe humming softly, maybe saying nothing at all. And then, through a small opening, or just placed on the ground nearby, your meal appears. if we can call it that. Medieval prison food was not designed to impress, or nourish particularly well, or even taste good. It was designed to keep you alive. Barely. Usually, it was bread. Hard bread. The kind that required effort to chew. Sometimes slightly stale. Sometimes very stale. Accompanied, if you were lucky, by a bit of watery soup. Not a rich, hearty stew like in the stories. No, more like warm water that had briefly met a vegetable at some point in its life. And that's your meal. You eat slowly, partly because there's nothing else to do, and partly because making it last feels important. Not in a dramatic way, just in a quiet, practical way. Because once the food is gone, you're back to waiting. Water might be provided too. Usually in a simple container. Not particularly clean, not particularly fresh, but enough. And then, the footsteps fade. And just like that, you're alone again. The silence returns. Not complete silence, of course. Dungeons had their own sounds. Dripping water was common. A slow, rhythmic drip from somewhere unseen. Almost like a clock, except much less helpful. Occasionally, you might hear something else. A distant cough. A quiet shuffle. Another prisoner, somewhere nearby. Not visible. Not reachable. Just present. And over time, those small sounds become oddly comforting. Proof that you're not entirely alone, even if you never actually meet anyone. Now, let's talk about light. Or rather, the lack of it. Some dungeons had very small openings. Tiny slits in the wall where a thin line of light might enter during the day. But in many cases, there was nothing. Just darkness. Not pitch-black horror movie darkness. More like a constant dimness. Your eyes adjust, eventually. Shapes become faintly visible. Edges blur together. It's not scary after a while. It's just normal. Which is perhaps the strangest part. Humans are surprisingly adaptable. Even to things that, at first, seem completely unbearable. So the prisoner adapts. They learn the boundaries of their space without needing to see clearly. They know where the wall is, where the floor dips slightly, where the straw is, if there is any. They settle into stillness. Movement becomes minimal, not just because of chains or space, but because there's no reason to move. No destination. No task. No change. And slowly, their world becomes smaller. Not physically, but mentally. Thoughts drift. Memories come and go. Sometimes clear, sometimes fading. You might think about your past. Your home. People you knew. Conversations you had. Small details that suddenly feel very important, like the way sunlight looked in a certain room. Or the sound of someone laughing. But even those thoughts, over time, become less sharp. They soften. They repeat. And eventually, they quiet down. Because there's only so many times you can replay the same memory before it starts to lose its edges. And so, the prisoner sits. Or lies down. Or shifts slightly. Hours pass. Or maybe minutes. It's hard to tell. Hunger fades after eating. Then slowly returns. Thirst comes and goes. The body adjusts to less. Less food. Less movement. Less everything. And in this slow, uneventful cycle, a kind of routine forms. Not a structured one. Not a productive one. Just a pattern. Wake, or something like waking. Wait. Eat, if food comes. Wait again. Rest, or try to. And repeat. Day after day. Without change. Without interruption. Without much of anything at all. And strangely, that's what made it so difficult. Not pain. Not constant suffering. But the absence of variation. The endless sameness. Because humans, as it turns out, don't just need food and water. They need change. Movement. Interaction. Something new, even if it's small. And in a medieval dungeon, those things were in very short supply. So the prisoner continues, slowly adjusting, slowly settling into this quiet, repetitive existence. And as the hours drift by, with nothing much happening, we'll gently move into the next part of this story, where routine stays the same, but the mind begins to do something a little more unusual. So, we left our prisoner sitting in that same small space, where nothing really changes, and yet, somehow everything slowly does. Because after a while, when the body has adjusted to the cold stone, the limited food, and the stillness, something else begins to shift. Very gently. Very quietly. The mind starts to wander. Not in an exciting way. Not in a dramatic, storytelling kind of way. More like a slow drifting. Like a leaf floating on still water, moving without direction, without urgency. At first, thoughts are fairly normal. The prisoner might think about how long they've been there. A reasonable question, of course, except there's no real answer. Without sunlight, without a routine, without any clear sense of day and night, time becomes uncertain. Was it 3 days? A week? Longer? It's difficult to tell. And after a while, the question itself becomes less important. Because there's nothing to measure it against. No calendar. No clock. Not even a changing sky. Just the same dim surroundings, over and over again. So instead, the mind shifts to something else. Memories. At first, they arrive clearly. Almost vividly. A familiar place. A street, perhaps. A home. The sound of footsteps on wood instead of stone. The feeling of sunlight, which now feels oddly distant, like something imagined rather than remembered. Faces appear too. Family, friends, maybe even strangers whose names were never known but whose presence once felt ordinary. And the strange thing is, these memories don't arrive all at once. They come slowly. One at a time. Lingering longer than they used to. Because here, there's nothing to interrupt them. No distractions. No responsibilities pulling attention away. So the prisoner might sit, completely still, replaying a single memory over and over. Not because they want to, but because there's nothing else to replace it with. And over time, those memories begin to change. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Just, slightly. Details blur. Voices become softer. Edges fade. A face that was once perfectly clear becomes less defined. A place that once felt familiar starts to feel uncertain. And yet, the mind keeps returning to them. Because even imperfect memories are better than nothing at all. Now, somewhere in the distance, there might be a sound again. A faint shuffle. Maybe a cough. Another prisoner. Still there. Still unseen. And for a brief moment, the mind shifts outward. There's someone else. Not here, but close enough to exist. And that thought alone can be, strangely comforting. But communication? That's rare. Some dungeons were quiet not because people weren't there, but because speaking didn't change anything. Words had nowhere to go. No one to respond. So even the idea of conversation begins to fade. And instead, the mind starts to talk to itself. Not in a loud, obvious way. Just, internally. Small thoughts. Observations. Questions that don't really need answers. Was the bread better yesterday? Did I hear footsteps earlier, or was that something else? Is it colder today, or does it just feel that way? These aren't important questions. They don't lead anywhere. But they fill space. And in a place where space is empty, that matters. Now, let's gently move into something a bit more subtle. Because when there's very little happening outside, the inside becomes louder. Not loud in volume, but in presence. Thoughts stretch out. Silence feels deeper. And time slows even further. A single moment can feel extended. Not in a stressful way, just in a very drawn-out, almost quiet way. Like waiting in a room where nothing changes, and no one is coming. The prisoner might start noticing very small things. The texture of the wall. Rough in some places, smoother in others. The sound of their own breathing. In and out, steady, predictable. The way the chain shifts slightly when they move. A familiar sound now. Almost routine. These details become important. Not because they are interesting, but because they are there. And when there's nothing else, there is enough. Now, of course, the body still follows its own quiet rhythm. Hunger returns, slowly. Thirst comes and goes. Fatigue settles in, even without much activity. And sleep, or something like it, happens in small, uneven moments. There's no clear bedtime. No clear waking moment. Just, drifting in and out. Sometimes the prisoner might close their eyes and imagine something different. A field. A road. Even just light. Not detailed scenes, just impressions. Soft, incomplete images that don't quite form into full pictures. And sometimes, those imagined moments feel almost real. Not in a confusing way, just in a comforting way. Like a gentle escape that doesn't last very long, but doesn't need to. Because even a brief change is still a change. Now let's float, slowly, into another small shift. Because after enough time passes, the mind doesn't just remember. It begins to simplify. Complex thoughts become shorter. Long ideas shrink into small, quiet observations. Instead of thinking, "I wonder how long I've been here and what's happening outside," it becomes something more like, "It's quiet. And that's enough." There's no urgency to solve anything. No need to reach conclusions. The mind, in a way, adapts to the pace of the environment. Slow, steady, uneventful. And with that, emotions also become softer. Not gone. Just less sharp. Fear might have been there at the beginning. Confusion too. Maybe even anger. But those feelings require energy. And in a place where energy is limited, they gradually fade. What remains is something more neutral. A kind of quiet acceptance. Not dramatic. Not philosophical. Just simple. This is how things are. And so, the prisoner continues. Sitting. Waiting. Thinking, less and less. Listening to the same faint sounds. Feeling the same cold air. Watching, or not watching, the same dim space. And as the mind settles further into this slow, repetitive rhythm. So, by now, our prisoner has settled into something that almost feels like a rhythm. Not a busy rhythm. Not a productive one. Just a slow, repeating pattern of being. And strangely, this is where things begin to feel normal. Not good, of course. No one would choose this. But the human mind has a very quiet habit of adapting, even to things that once felt completely unbearable. At the beginning, everything stood out. The cold floor. The heavy air. The silence that seemed too large for such a small space. But now, those things don't feel new anymore. They've blended into the background. The cold is just there. The darkness is just there. The stillness is just how things are. And when everything stays the same for long enough, the mind stops reacting. Not because it doesn't notice, but because there's no reason to. So the prisoner sits, or lies down, or shifts slightly, without much thought behind it. Movements become slower. Not forced, just naturally reduced. Why move quickly, when there's nowhere to go? Why adjust often, when nothing changes? Even the chains, if they're there, don't feel as intrusive as they once did. At first, they might have been uncomfortable. Distracting. Now, they're just part of the environment. A soft, familiar weight. And occasionally, when they move, there's that quiet metallic sound again, a gentle scrape against stone. Not unpleasant. Not pleasant either. Just known. Now, let's drift a little further into this stillness. Because one of the more subtle changes is how the prisoner begins to experience time. Or rather, how they stop experiencing it in the usual way. There's no longer a strong sense of before and after. Moments don't feel like they're leading anywhere. They simply exist. One after another. Without urgency. without expectation. And this might sound uncomfortable, but in a strange way, it can also feel lighter. Because when there's nothing to prepare for, nothing to finish, nothing to chase, there's also nothing to worry about. No deadlines. No responsibilities. No decisions. Just the present moment. And another one after that. Now, of course, the body still has its quiet needs. Hunger comes, slowly. Not sharp. Not demanding. Just a gentle reminder that something is missing. And when food arrives again, which it eventually does, it's received with the same calm awareness as before. The bread is still hard. The soup is still thin. But now, there's no comparison. No thought of, this used to be better. It's simply, food. Something to eat. And that's enough. The prisoner might take their time with it, not out of strategy, but because time itself doesn't feel limited anymore. There's no need to rush. No next activity waiting. Just this small, quiet moment, of eating. And then, once it's gone, back to stillness. Now, let's gently shift towards something a little more internal again. Because as the outside world becomes simpler, the inside world does something interesting. It becomes quieter too. Earlier, there were many thoughts. Questions. Memories. Small observations filling the empty space. But now, even those begin to fade. Not completely. Just, less frequent. The mind no longer feels the need to fill every moment. Silence becomes comfortable. And in that silence, awareness changes slightly. Instead of thinking about things, the prisoner might simply notice them. The feeling of breath. The stillness of the body. The faint sounds that come and go. There's no need to label anything. No need to analyze. Just noticing. And this kind of awareness, while very simple, has a certain calmness to it. Not the kind of calm you'd find in a peaceful garden, but a quieter, more neutral calm. A calm that comes from having nothing to disturb it. Now, occasionally, something small might interrupt this steady state. Footsteps again. A door opening somewhere in the distance. A brief sound that doesn't last very long. And for a moment, attention shifts. Not sharply. Just, slightly. The prisoner might listen. Wait. And then, as quickly as it appeared, the sound fades. And everything returns to stillness. No reaction needed. No follow-up. Just, a small change in an otherwise unchanging environment. Now, let's slowly move towards something a bit more subtle, something that doesn't happen all at once, but builds over time. Because when life becomes this simple, this repetitive, the sense of self begins to soften. Not disappear. Just become less defined. There's no longer a strong sense of role. No, I need to do this, or I should be that. Those ideas belong to a world with activity, with expectations, with interaction. Here, none of that exists. So the prisoner is simply present. Not a worker. Not a friend. Not even really a prisoner, in the active sense. Just a person in a space. Existing. And that existence becomes very quiet. Very simple. Now, from the outside, this might seem like a loss. And in many ways, it is. But from within this slow, steady rhythm, it doesn't feel dramatic. There's no sudden realization. No moment of panic. Just a gradual shift into something more minimal. And so, the hours, or what we might still call hours, continue to pass. The prisoner remains where they are. Breathing slowly. Moving occasionally. Thinking less. Noticing more. And as this quiet pattern continues, without interruption. Hey guys, tonight, we're going to settle into something a little darker, but in a very calm, very slow way. So maybe lower the lights, get comfortable, and just let your mind drift as we step into a place where time barely moves, and life becomes very simple. Not easy. Just simple. Tonight, we're looking at punishments, and the strangely quiet ways people manage to survive them, inside medieval dungeons. And don't worry, this isn't going to be loud or dramatic. No sudden shocks, no intense moments. Just a slow walk through a world where everything is repetitive, a little uncomfortable, and oddly uneventful. So, let's begin. Now, when we think about medieval punishments, it's very easy to imagine something extreme. Something dramatic. Something that happens quickly and loudly. But in reality, many punishments were slow. Very slow. Because instead of quick consequences, a lot of people were simply placed somewhere and left there. A dungeon wasn't always about immediate suffering. It was more like long-term inconvenience. Taken to an almost professional level. You might be brought in, quietly. No grand speech, no elaborate ceremony. Just a guard, a door, and a space that doesn't really welcome you, but also doesn't actively push you away. It just exists. And now, so do you. Punishment, in this case, wasn't about constant action. It was about removal. Removed from light. Removed from people. Removed from routine. Which, if you think about it, is a very subtle way to make everything feel slightly off. Because humans rely on small things. Familiar sounds, daily habits, casual conversations. And once those are gone, the absence becomes noticeable. At first. Then slowly, less so. Now, let's gently look at what punishment actually felt like in this kind of setting. It wasn't always physical. Not in the way people often imagine. Sure, there could be discomfort. Cold stone, limited food, restricted movement. But the real punishment was more environmental. You sit for long periods. You wait, without knowing for what. And over time, the lack of change becomes the main experience. Now, of course, there were moments that reminded you that this wasn't exactly a relaxing retreat. Chains, for example. Not always tight. Not always painful. But present. A constant, quiet reminder that your movement had limits. That your space was defined, even if you didn't try to test those boundaries very often. And if you did move, there it was again. That soft metallic sound. Not sharp. Not aggressive. Just, there. Like a background note that never fully disappears. Then there's the food. Or more accurately, the idea of food. It arrives occasionally. Not with any kind of consistency that you could rely on. And when it does, it's simple. Bread, usually. And not the fresh, warm kind you might imagine. This is more like something that has been sitting quietly for a while, just like you. Hard. Slightly stubborn. But edible. And maybe, if things are going particularly well, a bit of thin soup. Not rich. Not filling. Just, present. Enough to keep things going. And that's the key word here. Enough. Because punishment in a dungeon often meant living at the edge of just enough. Just enough food. Just enough water. Just enough space. Nothing extra. Nothing comfortable. Just enough to continue. Now, let's drift into something a little more interesting. Because despite all of this, people did survive. Not everyone, of course. But many did. And the way they survived wasn't through strength or dramatic effort. It was through adjustment. Slow, quiet adjustment. A prisoner might begin by counting things. Not in a precise way, just loosely. How many times did I hear footsteps today? How many times did I shift from one side to the other? These aren't important measurements. They don't lead anywhere. But they create a sense of structure. Something to notice. Something to repeat. And repetition, in a place like this, becomes surprisingly valuable. Because it gives the mind something to hold on to. Now, sometimes, there might be interaction. Very limited. Very brief. A guard placing food down. Maybe saying a word or two. Or maybe not. And that small moment becomes part of the day. Not exciting. Just different. And that difference matters. Some prisoners might even try to extend that moment. A glance. A quiet question. Something simple. Not because they expect a long conversation, but because even a short exchange feels like movement. Now, let's gently move toward the idea of survival stories. Not the dramatic kind. No sudden escapes or clever tricks. Just quiet persistence. There are accounts, scattered here and there, of prisoners who simply endured. Days turning into weeks. Weeks into something longer. And during that time, they didn't do anything extraordinary. They adjusted. They learned the space. They accepted the routine. And slowly, they became part of it. One such pattern that often appeared was the creation of small habits. Maybe the prisoner would sit in the same position for a while, then shift slightly. Not because they had to, but because it created a sense of progression. A before and after. Another small habit might be listening. Focusing on distant sounds. Trying to identify them. Footsteps. Drips of water. A faint movement somewhere beyond the walls. These sounds became markers. Not of time, exactly. But of change. And in a place where change is rare, even the smallest variation becomes noticeable. Now, of course, not all punishments were identical. Some dungeons were deeper, darker, more isolated. Others allowed a bit more space, a bit more light. But the general idea remained the same. You are placed here. And you remain here. For a while. Maybe a long while. And during that time, survival becomes less about action, and more about stillness. Now, let's slowly drift into something a bit more reflective. Because when you remove almost everything from a person's daily life, what remains is very basic. Breathing. Sitting. Waiting. And in that simplicity, there's a kind of quiet endurance that develops. Not heroic. Not dramatic. Just steady. The prisoner continues. They eat when food arrives. They rest when their body feels tired. They listen to the same sounds. They exist in the same small space. And over time, that existence becomes manageable. Not comfortable, but familiar. And familiarity, even in a dungeon, has a way of softening things. Just slightly. So as the hours pass, slowly, quietly. And the routine continues without much change. We'll gently move forward, into the next part of this story. Where survival becomes even more subtle. And the line between punishment and simple existence begins to blur, just a little more.
So, we left our prisoner in a place where punishment doesn't really shout. It just sits there. Patient. Consistent. A bit like a very unenthusiastic supervisor who never leaves the room. And over time, something interesting happens. Not exciting. Not dramatic. Just interesting in a very quiet way. The prisoner begins to develop habits. Very small ones. Not the kind you'd proudly list in a productivity journal. More like gentle patterns that make the day feel slightly less shapeless. Because when every day looks exactly the same, the mind starts looking for anything that feels different. Even if that difference is extremely subtle. So maybe the prisoner decides, without really deciding, to sit in one position for a while. And then, after some time, they shift. That's it. That's the event. But in a place where nothing happens, even that counts. It creates a tiny sense of sequence. A before and an after. And that's surprisingly helpful. Now, of course, this isn't done with enthusiasm. No one's thinking, yes, time for my scheduled sitting adjustment. It's more like a quiet instinct. A need to mark the passage of something, even if you're not quite sure what that something is. And slowly, these small habits begin to repeat. Sit. Shift. Rest. Listen. And then, again. Now let's gently move into something else the mind tends to do, when it has very little to work with. It begins to create structure. Not a full routine. That would require more control than the prisoner actually has. But a loose, flexible structure built around the few things that do happen. For example, food. Whenever it arrives, it becomes a kind of anchor. Not because it's exciting, but because it's one of the only predictable changes. So the prisoner might begin to think, in a very soft, undefined way. Before food. After food. And just like that, a sort of timeline appears. Not accurate. Not precise. But present. And that's enough. Now, let's talk about listening again. Because it becomes one of the most consistent activities in this quiet environment. The prisoner listens, not actively, not with focus, but just naturally. Because when there's nothing else happening, sound becomes more noticeable. A faint drip. A distant step. The soft rustle of movement, maybe from another cell, maybe from somewhere further away. And over time, these sounds begin to feel familiar. Recognizable. Almost like quiet companions that never quite introduce themselves. The prisoner might even begin to anticipate them. Not consciously. Just subtly. There's that sound again. No surprise. No reaction. Just recognition. Now, occasionally, something slightly different might happen. Maybe the footsteps come at a different time. Maybe there's a pause where there wasn't one before. And for a brief moment, the mind notices. Not with alarm. Just with mild curiosity. But then, everything settles back into its usual pattern. And that small variation fades into memory. Now let's drift into something a little more internal again. Because survival in this kind of space isn't really about physical strength. It's about mental adjustment. And one of the ways the mind adjusts is by lowering expectations. Not in a sad way. Not in a dramatic, all hope is lost kind of way. Just naturally. If nothing changes, the mind stops expecting change. And when expectations fade, disappointment fades with them. So the prisoner no longer waits for something better. They simply experience what is already there. The same space. The same routine. The same slow passage of time. And without expectation, there's less resistance. Which makes everything feel slightly easier. Not comfortable. Just manageable. Now, let's gently touch on something that might seem a bit unusual. Because sometimes, in this quiet, repetitive environment, the mind begins to play. Very softly. Not games in the usual sense. Nothing structured. Just small, simple mental activities. Counting breaths. Following the sound of a drip, and seeing how long it takes to repeat. Imagining shapes in the darkness, even if they're barely visible. These are not distractions in the modern sense. They don't fully occupy attention. They simply add a layer. A thin layer of activity on top of stillness. And that layer helps pass the time. Or at least, makes the time feel slightly less empty. Now, of course, the body continues its slow rhythm. Hunger returns, gently. Thirst follows. Fatigue settles in. Even though very little has been done. And rest happens again. Not deep, uninterrupted sleep, but short, uneven periods of drifting in and out. And over time, this cycle becomes familiar. Predictable in its unpredictability. Now, let's quietly move into the idea of resilience. Not the bold, inspiring kind. The quiet kind. The kind that doesn't look impressive, because it doesn't need to. The prisoner survives, not by fighting, but by continuing. Day after day. Moment after moment. With very little change, and very little resistance. And that continuity becomes its own form of strength. A steady presence. Not pushing forward, just not stopping. Now, occasionally, there might be a thought. A simple one. This is still happening. Not dramatic. Not emotional. Just an observation. And then, the thought fades. Because there's nothing to add to it. No conclusion. No action. Just awareness. And so, the prisoner remains in the same space, with the same sounds, following the same small habits, living through the same slow pattern, again and again. And as this quiet endurance continues, without interruption, we can gently drift into the next part of this long, steady story, where survival becomes even more subtle, and the idea of punishment slowly blends into something that feels almost ordinary,